Tens of millions are in lockdown as the world tries to combat COVID-19. Are these measures drastic enough? And as the virus attacks our bodies, what impact will the pandemic have on our minds? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the coronavirus crisis. We could be facing the most severe public health emergency since the Spanish flu. Today, people around the globe are isolating themselves as the world takes on the coronavirus. Many fear the final death toll could end up in the millions, and several nations are taking severe action. Schools and offices have shut in many countries, and major sporting events are postponed. But could this just be the beginning? One report from Imperial College, London, says the pandemic could continue for 18 months. Making long-term isolation a very real possibility. We've already seen anxious individuals emptying supermarket shelves in a panic. What other psychological and societal impacts could we see? We'll discuss that in a moment, but first, Haider Abbasi has this report.
To slow the spread of the virus, act like you already have it. That's the message from doctors. The result is this: near empty streets in the world's largest cities. So where is everyone? Millions are now working or studying from home, and that's where many will remain. Self-isolation and social distancing are the new buzzwords. The World Health Organization says Europe is now the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic, and Europe is acting accordingly.
The rules are simple, but the general rule is simpler still. Stay at home. That's how you can help stop this disease from spreading. That's how you can help our medical workers and our health system. That's how you can become allies in our war against COVID-19.
France has deployed 100,000 police officers to enforce a lockdown. Anyone that's caught violating the new restrictions faces a fine of up to $150. Other countries have issued similar orders. Social spaces such as bars, restaurants and cafes are off limits. Big sporting and music events have been cancelled. Italy is the centre of the epicenter. Thousands have died there, and tens of thousands of Italians are infected. That's despite nationwide restrictions. But some feel their governments are overreacting.
I want to go to work. I need to have some money, or I'll be on unpaid leave, and then I can't buy anything, and then I'm on the street. So I'd much rather everyone just calm down.
But there's nothing calming about corona. This is what's happening in supermarkets around the world: panic buying and stockpiling. And then there's the misinformation spreading online. Doctors are keen to debunk myths about the virus being killed by cold weather or by drinking lots of water. The odd one out in Europe is Britain. Its leaders have been criticised for acting slowly and giving conflicting messages. British schools and universities remain open. And while people are advised to avoid crowded places, no firm restrictions have been imposed on social spaces. But Prime Minister Boris Johnson has urged people to stay at home.
And the problem is not with the health systems, it's the numbers of sufferers. That's why we announced the steps yesterday that we did, advising against all unnecessary contact, steps that are unprecedented since World War II.
Will self-isolation and social distancing be enough to slow the spread of coronavirus? Are governments taking the right action? And is the world prepared for life as we know it to be on pause indefinitely? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in London is Lilley. He's a former NHS Trust Chairman and now a writer on issues affecting the UK's health service. Dan Parnell is a senior lecturer in sports business at Liverpool University. And in Montreal, Canada, is Samuel Veissiere. He's an assistant professor of psychiatry at McGill University. Good to have you all on the program, gentlemen. And just for the viewers' sake, we often invite our guests to studios in their respective cities. You can see they're all on Skype. This is an example of self-isolation. We had guest options also here in Istanbul, but we're not letting anybody in the building as well. Everything is sort of as minimal as possible, right? Lilley, your government the UK, decided to do things slightly differently. Now, they've not done a full 180 on it. Maybe they've pivoted 150 degrees on their initial plan. Are they doing the right thing, or is it just an example that we just don't know what to do with this thing, so we're all playing a bit of a guessing game at the moment?
Well, the politicians are telling us that they're being led. The politicians are telling us that they're being led by the science. What we're doing here is incrementally cranking up the amount of self-isolation that people are going through. Just as we came on air, I see that on the news wires that the schools in Scotland and Wales will be closing as of next week, and I expect the English schools to follow. What we try to do is to introduce restrictions and limitations gradually, in the hope, I think, that there will be some herd immunity emerging from it, and to try and keep the economy ticking over. There are three things we need to do. One is to try and find some herd immunity. Secondly is to cocoon the elderly and the vulnerable. And thirdly is to keep the economy working. Now, it's probably worth pointing out that we are just behind what is happening in Italy. We're about 3 or 4 weeks behind. We fully accept that there's a deluge of patients to come, but at the moment we're introducing the steps incrementally, because if you look at what's happening in Lombardy, for example, they've closed the whole place down. What happens when you have to open the place up again? The risk is that there will be further infection because there's no herd immunity. And I think that's the risk in all of these capital cities and the countries around the world who have just completely shut up shop. It's inconceivable when they open up again that there won't be reinfection.
Samuel, a lot of people want to know that the experts know what they're doing, especially in a crisis. Now, you have ordinary people watching the news, reading the newspapers. They're looking at the UK, and the UK has a different view of this. They're looking at other countries that are under complete lockdown. And in spite of all of this and these varying methods and so on, the virus continues to permeate. People continue to be hospitalized. People continue to die. Tell me how much of an impact that has on individuals and groups as well, where it seems as if no matter what you do, last week the death toll was at 4,000. A week later it's at 8,000 and it's sure to rise. Tell me how that impacts people.
Thank you. First, it's important to point out that I'm not an expert in infectious diseases or public health. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a cognitive scientist.
Certainly.
So my worry at this point is more about psychological herd immunity. And I'm just wondering what's going on in terms of the mental health consequences of what is also an epidemic of anxiety. From a physical health perspective, it does appear that the pandemic poses quite a low risk to the general population, a moderate risk to older people, and a high risk to immunocompromised populations. So it's interesting and inspiring to see that never before in human history have we seen such a huge mobilization and coordination of effort to help a very small percentage of the population that is at risk. That is very, very good. However, in thinking of how to foster resilience, we also need to ask, well, what are the psychological consequences of so much panic and so many drastic measures with so many drastic consequences on the economy, on our freedom of movement, on society, but also on people's ability to cultivate psychological coping mechanisms.
Right.
So these are the questions I'm asking.
Right, and I want to circle back to it in a few minutes' time when we talk about how people collectively view others, how they view foreigners and so on, because this is massive, right? It could profoundly change societies in ugly ways, and that's the most ominous thing about it. Dan Parnell, no football. People are absolutely mortified at the thought of that. I mean, they were mortified at the thought of the leagues shutting down. They didn't like the idea of football being played behind closed doors, and then the leagues were paused for the foreseeable future. They're not going to come back up in early April. I think we can all agree on that. But it's about more than football, isn't it? Because these are mega industries, aren't they, Dan?
Yes, of course. So with no football, we have no idea of what we're meant to do. The interesting thing about football, and probably why it's raised a lot of tensions, is that we view football as an individual sport in different countries, when in reality football is a very globally networked sport. So we've seen the virus hit our geography in terms of Europe at different rates. So Italy and Spain and different intensities, and they've took action, their football authorities and their politicians, to first off postpone and play football matches behind doors, and then to put their countries into a tighter, restrictive lockdown. Whereas our football players who are from these countries, and we've got players out in those countries, I begin to check and challenge what is actually going on and why football in the UK and politicians in the UK have been so slow to react.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
We're at a very interesting standpoint.
Right. And I want to ask Roy Lilley, if we look at maybe some of the high-profile instances of people connected to football contracting the virus. So Callum Hudson-Odoi, Chelsea player, Mikel Arteta, the Arsenal coach. Did it take for that to happen, for celebrities to get it, for football authorities to finally realize, okay, maybe this is serious?
Do you know, I think the closing down of football stadiums and 70,000 people in close proximity, I think that was going to happen anyway. What happened, I think, was the football industry realized that if players started to get the disease, then they couldn't play. And then they're left with a big problem with what do you do with leagues, league places, championships, who wins what. And I mean, I think if the government had said, we want you to stop playing football, there'd have been an unholy row. All of the money involved, and the sports rights and the broadcasting. But what's happened here is the industry, the football industry, in its own best interests, has said, we're going to stop playing because we don't want players to contract the disease. It's spasmodic. We can't run anything properly. So we might as well just close it all down. And of course, you know, that's had a huge impact right across Europe and indeed the world, because the European Championships also have been cancelled. I mean, it is coming back to my earlier point about herd immunity. Getting a lot of young, fit people in one place to kind of each give them a not too bad cold and a not too bad dose of the flu means that we'll get a lot of people through this. A lot of people will recover, and a lot of people will be back to work and help to get the economy going again. But it is interesting how the industry took the decision in its own best interests. It wasn't the government that made them do it. We're seeing the same in theatre land now, and of course in a lot of other entertainment events. So it's quite an interesting phenomenon. Right.
Samuel, the fact that people don't have football as a release, or the theatre as a release, or those concerts and so on in a time of crisis, because often in a time of crisis, there are a few little things still left in society where people can come together and have this collective release and this sense of catharsis, right? Yes, they have YouTube and everybody's doing these cute TikTok videos while they're in isolation, but it's not the same thing. How much does that damage your coping mechanism in a time of difficulty, in a time of uncertainty?
That's a very good question. What we as societies are trying to navigate now is finding that balance, that trade-off between social distancing, which appears to be advantageous to some degree, and avoiding too much social isolation, which from a mental health perspective tends to be quite disastrous. So we're social beings. We need to connect with others. We need to be around others, even to improve our immune function. So this is the trade-off that we're going to have to negotiate. It may be the case that for younger people in Western countries who are already used to a more sort of individualistic, isolated lifestyle, they're finding ways to connect online. I know my son this morning was doing school online, and he's chatting with his friends, and he seems to be relatively unbothered by this. But it is evident that people need to find ways to connect, both in person and then through the internet if need be, because social connections are really key to foster both psychological and immunological resilience.
Right. And I'm going to use this as a way to segue to economic issues. Dan, there's a question of Liverpool not getting the league title, possibly, if the season is scrapped, right? I'm a Man United fan, so don't ask me my opinion about that. But I mean, beyond that, more serious questions about specific teams, specific clubs, for example, right? Where your entire business model is based on advertising revenue, TV revenues, and gate receipts, right? Not every club is a mega marketing machine a la Real Madrid or United or Barcelona or Liverpool with merchandising and so on. So the longer this goes on, there's a very real possibility that some clubs could even go bust, right? So we don't even know what's going to happen there. Tell me about the impact economically on the game, and then, if you will, sort of extend that a little bit more broadly as this collective anxiety endures and life is on pause as the months tick along.
Yeah. So first off, if we look at UEFA's decision to postpone their flagship men's national competition, so it was meant to be hosted, the European 2020 Championships this summer has been delayed till 2021. Now, that postponement, part of the rationale, apart from protecting the health and safety of fans, spectators, and the well-being of the players, is also to allow our domestic leagues in Europe to continue to finish their leagues. So it's reportedly going to cost potentially 4.2 billion if the big five leagues in Europe do not complete their leagues. Not more than that. And ultimately what people are coming to terms with is that we don't really know what's going to happen. And a lot of the consequences of us not finishing leagues and the decisions that we make now within the boardroom are going to be finished within a courtroom. And it's going to be left to lawyers to help work out the finer details of the consequence of that. If we think more broadly about football, the footballing elite, so the teams that are in the Premier League or top divisions across Europe, they are insulated in some respects against this financial turmoil that many are facing. Teams in the lower leagues in England, such as teams in the English Football League, have a number of ongoing problems. So before the coronavirus kicked in and started to have an impact, in February, 2 teams in the English Football League didn't pay their players' wages. And that was just in February when they were still having merchandise and gate receipts and whatnot. We're now in a position where teams haven't had pay for a couple of weeks, and they're starting to feel a serious financial pinch taking place. Right. Also, when usually when we don't have a match day, we are able to use the stadium to have weddings, functions, different activities, social events. With the tightening and the lockdown and restrictions, and with this attempt to socially distance people, less events are taking place, and the club are also losing more money that way. So I think a number of clubs in the lower leagues are definitely going to come under financial distress and will be close to the brink in terms of wherever they survive.
Right, and this could be seen as a microcosm for other businesses, other industries, because people are already being laid off. These industries are already feeling the stress of coronavirus and its impacts. Roy, Lilley, as we've heard from the experts so far over the past few weeks, all that can be done really is to try and mitigate the effects of this, right? Even flattening the curve is not necessarily tackling the virus per se, but just sort of spreading it out over a period of time. Now, I recall that moment where US President Donald Trump was with some of his scientific advisors, and he had his arms folded and he was asking, when can we get a vaccine? And they were saying, man, it could be, as soon as a year, maybe 18 months. And he kept on pushing, almost as if this was a real estate deal, and he was asking them to sort of, push harder to build the tower faster, right? And people want to get their economies going faster. They don't want to lose business. They don't want people to be laid off and so on. And is that one of the fundamental problems here that the doctors have and the scientists have, is that a vaccine will sort this out, but a vaccine will take time to go through clinical trials. And people need to understand that this is going to be painful. Whether it's for 6 months, a year and a half, it's going to be painful. Is it difficult to get that message across, Roy?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, normally in the flu season, we expect that we'll have a flu jab, and millions of people have a flu jab. The actual the flu jab itself is decided on probably in the late summer, and we judge what the virus is going to be. We then make the virus generated, the flu jabs are distributed, and that's how we get what we call herd immunity. That's because we've all had a flu jab, and the virus doesn't rip-roar its way through our economy and our lives and our families. What's happened here is this is what's called a novel virus. That means it means we don't really know what it's made of. We don't really know where it's coming from. We're not very sure how it's going to behave. Now, we do need, because we can't get herd immunity by giving people a flu jab or a coronavirus jab, we've got to get herd immunity with people catching the virus. As far as getting a virus, a flu jab is concerned, well, you're right. I mean, it takes something. Generally speaking, we're looking at generating a virus inoculation over probably 2 or even 3 years. There's talk now that we'll be able to do it in a year, which is an enormous. I mean, I can't begin to tell you or to reference how what an achievement it will be to be able to do it in a year. I think it's highly unlikely we'll do it under a year unless we're really very lucky. And then once we've got that, we've got some kind of herd immunity. But without that, it's been predicted here. I don't know what it's like in other parts of the world, but we're saying here, unless we can find a virus flu jab type thing, unless we can get herd immunity, or we'll just get everybody to go home and self-isolate, this will re-emerge again in November. And we'll have another spike and we'll have to do this all over again.
Yeah, that's pretty worrying. Samuel, I want to talk about the better angels of our nature and then the flip side of that. So we've seen great moments of collective solidarity, compassion. We've also seen people punch each other up over toilet paper, right? Historically, I'm no historian, but there does seem to be a correlation that every time there's infectious disease, people tend to be more xenophobic, tend to be more nationalistic. The idea of virus and connected to the other becomes both literal and metaphorical. The US president has called it the Chinese virus multiple times now. He's tweeted a couple times today about it as well. Tell me about your worst fears when it comes to us not being good human beings about this.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's important to point out that we're noticing two broad families of responses socially so far. So one is increased conflict and the other one is increased cooperation. So the first one, as you very correctly point out, the general evolutionary context is that human minds are fundamentally obsessed with potential threats. So better safe than sorry is how the human mind works. And there is a very interesting, somewhat worrying co-evolution of pathogens, animal-borne pathogens, and fear of the other. So throughout fairly recent human history in the past 7,000 years or so, there have been ravaging epidemics that have caused untold amounts of death. So a lot of societies have evolved fairly adaptive in the better safe than sorry sense, fear of others because strangers could potentially carry diseases. So we know that even our everyday intuitions and moral psychology, when we're afraid of other people or even afraid of novelty, tends to recruit pathogen detection mechanisms, fear of infection, disgust responses. So in times of pandemics, what has happened throughout history is there has often been increased xenophobia, increased discrimination towards marginalized groups. So unlike natural disasters that tend to foster great spontaneous cooperation and solidarity, pandemics are the kinds of disasters that may often predictably increase social conflict. At the same time, what we have seen on a global scale here, and even on smaller national scales, is a lot of cooperation. So remember that because our minds are obsessed with negative information, we tend to pay more attention to negative events. So even the news cycle will tend to report an isolated event of panic hoarding, when in fact, we're not talking about the many untold acts of kindness among strangers, people patiently waiting in line, people denouncing xenophobia. So from my perspective, it is very likely that there are many more acts of cooperation and solidarity than the kinds of acts of panic and fear and discrimination that we tend to over-report in the media. So you mentioned the better angels of our natures. That's the title of a great book by Professor Steven Pinker, where Pinker understands the tribal limits on human psychology, but he also points out that we have in recent centuries increased the circle of empathy and solidarity. So throughout human history, as societies have become more integrated, we have seen more conflict, but we have also seen more solidarity and more cooperation. And uniting against a common threat that is very catchy and intuitive, like a pathogen, seems to work in terms of uniting humanity, right? Like climate change is too abstract a process
Right.
for people to comprehend and make good decisions about. So I'm optimistic.
Gentlemen, it's been fascinating talking to all of you. I mean, one thing is for certain, our systems of belief, our systems that we've built up physically, our political systems, economic systems, everything is more fragile than we thought it was. And I think that is quite humbling for all of us. We hope for the best, but none of us actually know really what's going on and how it's going to turn out. We really do hope for the best. Roy Lilley, Dan Parnell, and Samuel Veissiere, pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for watching this episode of the Newsmakers. We will see you next time.